Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Kristan Uhlenbrock. I am going to be your co-host for this series here, and I'm so glad to see so many people tuning in right now. We're going to get started. We've got another hour up of Wolves, where we're talking science and stories. Tonight's episode is going to be about media coverage and public perspectives on wolves, which you've heard Nicole mention if you've tuned in a little early. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge a land acknowledgement. And so with respect, I do want to acknowledge that myself and my guests reside on the traditional lands of 48 Native American tribes who now live throughout the American Southwest, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountains, including the Southern Ute, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Shoshone tribes. I also want to give us a little bit of housekeeping right here before we get started. We have an audience joining us on Zoom tonight. So hello, if you've joined us on Zoom. As Nicole mentioned, go ahead and open that chat. That is going to be where you ask us your questions tonight. If you've joined us on Facebook Live, you can use the comment feature for the questions. We have folks watching both of those platforms and feeding myself and my co-host questions that we can incorporate into the discussion. It is full on discussion tonight, so we definitely want to see and hear your questions along the way. This is number 2 in our series. This is a 5-part series where we've got every Thursday night, 5 p.m. Mountain Time, starting last week with science, this week on public perceptions and media, and then we've got 3 more topics following us for the next 3 Thursdays. In this series, we're going to be exploring the potential of wolf reintroduction to the state of Colorado through the lens of science, policy, and lived experiences. We're planning to bring together a really diverse array of experts and voices to engage with us on this topic throughout the series. I do want to recognize and thank our partners in putting this together, the Colorado State University Warner College of Natural Resources. There's a number of folks up there who've been helping this put together. Those who work at the Center for Collaborative Conservation, the Center for Human and Carnivore Coexistence, and our CSU Extension Program. And so with that, let me bring my co-host and co-moderator into tonight's discussion, John Sanderson, who is the Director for the Center for Collaborative Conservation at CSU. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Kristan, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As we did last week, tonight we'll be talking about a question that will be on your ballot on November 3rd. It's Proposition 114 with the title Reintroduction and Management of Gray Wolves. You may have heard this referred to earlier in the year as Ballot Initiative 107. Proposition 114 directs the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission to develop a plan to restore and manage gray wolves in Colorado and to take the steps necessary to begin reintroductions of gray wolves on the West Slope by December 31st, 2023. The proposition also requires the Commission to seek public input, assist livestock owners with preventing and resolving conflict between wolves and livestock, and compensate livestock owners for loss of livestock caused by wolves. In this series, we won't be telling you how to vote, but we hope this helps you make an informed decision. And we hope this one gives you some insight into how some of your friends and fellow Coloradans think about wolves and this issue in front of us here. So a quick request, we are eager to know if this series has helped you understand and engage on wolves. To that end, we've sent you all a pre-survey question on how you're thinking about wolves at the moment and some other questions along those lines. We ask if you would, fill out that pre-survey. Only fill out the pre-survey once, not before each episode, but once at some point in the series. And then you'll also be getting a post-survey after the series is concluded. Your survey responses will help us do better with this kind of event in the future, but also you're going to be contributing to a scientific study on public perception around wolves. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests, starting with Sam Brasch. Sam is a climate and environment reporter for Colorado Public Radio. Sam joined CPR in 2015 as the recipient of the organization's first news fellowship. Following his CPR fellowship, Sam was awarded an 11-hour food and farming journalism fellowship from the University of California, Berkeley. Sam joined Colorado Public Radio again in 2016 as a contract reporter, where he filled in for newscasts, reported on the state legislature, and supported long-term feature stories and interviews for Colorado Matters. Here's my favorite part. Before his career in broadcast journalism, Sam worked for Modern Farmer magazine, where he wrote articles on goat towers and lammy jammies. Welcome, Sam.
Glad to be here. Thank you guys so much.
Our second guest is my friend and colleague, Dr. Rebecca Niemiec. Becky is an assistant professor in the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department at Colorado State University. Becky has a PhD from the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources at Stanford University, and she has a BA in Ecology and Environmental Studies from Dartmouth College. Becky's research focuses on understanding the drivers and outcomes of community conservation action. She is particularly interested in applying conservation psychology theory and methods to design and evaluate community outreach and engagement programs for conservation. I'm honored to be Becky's colleague in CSU's Warner College of Natural Resources. Welcome, Becky.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight.
So let's go ahead and dive right into questions. Becky, I'd like to start with you. I know in your work, you've studied past surveys about perspectives towards wolves, and you've done your own surveys. In February, you convened a diverse group of stakeholders. And I'd be interested to know, what has your work shown you about public perspectives towards wolves in Colorado?
Absolutely. Happy to dive into that. So I'll start with a little bit of history about public attitudes towards wolves. So in the early 20th century, the public rhetoric around wolves was really different than it is now. And so, as many of you probably know, early settlers killed wolves not only to protect livestock, but also really out of fear of a species that had really kind of been demonized in folklore and myth. And so the federal government, state governments provided actual financial incentives in the form of bounties to kill wolves. And basically by the 1930s, wolves were gone from more than 95% of their historic range. But then we started to see a real public opinion shift in the mid 20th century that kind of coincided with increased interest in the preservation of wilderness more broadly. And so wolves became kind of a federally protected species in the United States in the 1970s through the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And then efforts to reintroduce and recover wolves began. And so now I'll give a little bit of a kind of a broad overview of public perspectives, and then there's some more nuance within those perspectives as well. And so right now, public attitudes towards wolves and wolf reintroduction throughout the US are generally pretty positive. And so there's a 2014 study of US residents throughout the country that found about 61% of respondents had positive attitudes towards wolves. But studies have also found that support really varies by stakeholder group, by geography. And generally, studies have found that ranchers, hunters, people living in areas with wolves tend to have more negative attitudes towards wolf conservation than people living outside of those areas. So here in Colorado, there's been a few different studies that have looked at public perspectives towards wolves. There's 3 total peer-reviewed published surveys. There was one in 1994 that was done as a mail survey of over 1,000 residents. There was one in 2001 that was done as a phone survey. And there's one most recently that I helped lead that was done as an online survey. And what those studies find is that in general, the Coloradoan population is pretty supportive of wolf reintroduction. So we find in the 2001 survey, it was about 65% of residents said they would vote for wolf reintroduction. 1994 survey said that 71% of residents would vote for wolf reintroduction. And then our survey most recently found that about 80% of residents would vote for wolf reintroduction. And we did find that support was pretty consistent across geographies and across stakeholder groups. And so we did find that actually both in the 1994 mail survey and our survey, so the majority of people both on the West Slope and on the Front Range supported wolf reintroduction. But that being said, and I can get into some of the reasons why, or I can get into that in a little bit later as well. People had a diversity of reasons why they supported wolf reintroduction, but I also wanted to mention that there are some folks who are quite opposed to wolf reintroduction for a variety of reasons that maybe I can get into a little bit more depth later. And I think it's worth mentioning that those who are deeply opposed to wolf reintroduction are often the ones facing really the negative impacts of wolves. And this is particularly the case of ranchers who will have to face the possibility of wolf depredation on livestock. So just keep in mind as I talk about how there's high levels of support, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider and seek to address those concerns of those who will be most negatively impacted by wolves.
Let me chime in here. I think what's going to be interesting is we're going to unpack a lot of that, Becky, because that was a lot there. And I actually find it's interesting, the increasing, I think in your Colorado studies, of interest and support for wolves. And we've got almost 300 people here on Zoom. And I'm really curious. We have a lot of folks, when I saw in the chat, from Colorado, but we do have folks from Minnesota and other parts of the country. So I'm wondering if Nicole, I want to poll our folks real quick and see, of those who've tuned in, how many of you have actually seen a wolf in the wild? So it's a yes and no answer. So if you're watching on Facebook Live and you hear me this, you don't get the poll, but type yes or no on Facebook Live. And if you're here on Zoom, just answer this real quick poll here. And we don't have to talk about it right now, but maybe it'll come back up. So I'm gonna give you just a few more seconds, and then I'm gonna bring Sam into this conversation too, because I'm actually quite curious, because Sam has been covering, so Sam's from CPR, and for those of you who are big radio fans or just love reading their stuff online like I do, anything you've seen on wolves is pretty much Sam has written it. So he's been following this topic real closely. Okay, Nicole, why don't you show the results so we can at least see them? Oh, interesting. Okay, so that is a surprise to me about how many people have seen a wolf in the wild. So 60% said that they have not, and 41% said that they have, and we have hundreds of people online tonight. Okay, that was fascinating. So Sam, reacting to that, or in general, come into this conversation here. What have you seen in your coverage of wolves? Like what's been driving some of that coverage for you in covering wolves? Yes, it's a ballot initiative, but what have you started to see and explore in that coverage? What's been overturned for you?
So I think sort of the really remarkable thing about this whole ballot fight is, I believe it was late last year in December that the state of Colorado confirmed that the people campaigning to reintroduce wolves had in fact collected enough signatures to get what is now Proposition 114 onto the ballot. The very next day, Colorado Parks and Wildlife announced that a pack was living in the state of Colorado. At that point, they hadn't confirmed it. They confirmed it later in February. But it has been this weird cross-section of people voting on whether to reintroduce an endangered species for the first time ever. No one ever has had the choice that's now before Colorado voters. And wolves also showing up in the state at the very same time, which creates all sorts of questions about, okay, what's actually going on here? Are they coming back on their own? Do we actually need to reintroduce them? So my coverage has been driven both by trying to inform voters about what they want to do in terms of reintroducing wolves or not, but also keeping track of this pack and what's happening to it, because that is an important aspect of this. And news on that pack has been sort of trickling out this whole year. First we noticed that there were 6 wolves living in Northwest Colorado. Then more recently, I heard news that they might have had puppies, which has not been confirmed. And then even more recently, we've gotten reports that as many as 3 of those wolves might have been killed in Wyoming. Again, that has not been completely confirmed yet, and I want to be really careful about stating that. But this whole saga of this single pack has been a really interesting layer that's gone on top of this whole sort of more conventional question of whether or not to reintroduce wolves on the ballot.
So if you didn't see the first episode, we encourage you to go back and look at that. There's you should see in your chat, in your Zoom chat, a link to that first episode where we actually tackled some really interesting policy issues related to the pack that has been confirmed in Northwest Colorado and other wolves that have naturally made their way on their own to Colorado versus this proposal to reintroduce wolves. Becky, I'd love to go back to you for a minute. So you mentioned that the strong opposition that you hear to wolves is often from people who may have livestock to lose that might be killed by wolves. But what are some of the other reasons you've heard that people are opposed to reintroducing wolves to Colorado? And then would you also share with us some of the reasons that most often cited for why people do want to see wolves in Colorado?
Absolutely. So in our survey, our most recent survey, we included some open-ended questions, which were, what are some of the, and basically the questions were, how do you think wolves will impact you personally, positively or negatively? So I'll start with the negatives here, and people gave a diversity of different responses here. What was interesting is the most common response in terms of being concerned about wolves was actually about human safety and this idea of wolves wandering into kind of residential areas and having to worry about people's safety. There was also concerns about people's pets and wolves potentially attacking people's pets. There were the concerns that I discussed about livestock depredation as well. There are concerns about wolves reducing populations of deer and elk. And alongside that, concerns about reducing hunting opportunities as well. And then more broadly, there were some concerns about the fact that management of wolves will be difficult, and making a compensation program work will be difficult. Trying to figure out how to fairly compensate ranchers for not just direct losses, but indirect losses. So there were a lot of concerns about that as well. On the positive side, we had the most common argument that people gave for supporting wolf restoration was the ability for wolves to restore balance to ecosystems or improve the environment in some way. So there's a lot of different responses within that general code, but that's kind of how we summarize that. Beyond that, a lot of people talked about opportunities to view wolves in the wild. They were really excited about being able to go out and view wolves. Alongside that, there was kind of the increase in potential tourism opportunities that people discussed. People also discuss what we call cultural or emotional connections to wolves. And this is this idea that, that wolves mean a lot to me personally, I'm speaking as a survey respondent here. And so a lot of people said, I have a cultural connection to them. I have an emotional connection to these animals. They got me interested in conservation. There's also what we call existence value, which is a concept often used in economics to describe environmental value. And that's this idea that it makes me feel positive to know that there are wolves out there, even if I never will see them. And it makes me feel good to know that wolves will be there for future generations. The other arguments that were positive that were given was perceived moral obligation. And so this was a code of anything around restoring wolves is the right thing to do, is what people said. And also this idea of wolves deserve to live on the landscape. And the last one that a couple of people talked about was actually wolves reducing pest populations. They thought that might happen, especially around deer. And this idea of enhanced state pride, that potentially they would feel excited to be in a state that prioritized restoration. So I think what we could see here is both on the negative and positive side, we have a really strong, wide diversity of different perceptions, both in favor and against wolf restoration here.
Sam, I'm guessing you've probably heard some of this in your reporting too, both some of the reasons and positive. I'm wondering if there's anything that stood out from you from any of your coverage of interviews and things that you've done about some of these both positive and negative perceptions to wolves, and what stood out for you?
I think everything Becky is talking about is absolutely true. A lot of people have a lot of feelings about wolves, and that's really important. I think a lot of my reporting, what's been really interesting is how much people's opinions about wolves really has to do with who gets control over wildlife. This whole ballot question is absolutely about how you feel about wolves, but it's also about power, right? Traditionally in the United States, big decisions about wildlife have been made by bureaucrats and scientists, people who, assess the situation, come to some sort of decision through meetings, through reports, and then do something about it. This is really different. And that's inspired a lot of calls of ballot box biology from people who oppose this initiative, like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, like former members of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, like State Representative Perry Will, who represents the district where wolves are living now in Colorado. They see this as an attack on their authority over wildlife, and they're worried about what sort of precedent this might set if people are literally voting to make the big decisions about wildlife and then telling bureaucrats what to do and scientists what to do, rather than, scientists and bureaucrats compiling information from the public. That's a very different model. And some of the people who support this initiative completely understand that and think it's exactly what should be happening. I think about a few people I interviewed for this first story I did about this way back in the spring. Larry Weiss, longtime wolf advocate, lives in Denver, and he sees this as absolutely an opportunity to completely change the game about who decides what happens to animals on the natural landscape in the United States.
May I jump in here and add a little bit more onto what Sam was saying?
Please.
Okay, awesome. Because I could not agree more, Sam, with what you were saying about this ballot initiative is really kind of a question over values and whose values are considered in decision making. And so I think one of the things that I want to say is that the decision about whether we want wolves or not is just as much of a value-based decision and a decision about power, just as Sam was saying, as it is a decision about biology. And so ecologists have found that wolves can thrive on this landscape. They've identified both positive and negative impacts from wolves. Some positive impacts, but probably not as positive as some people would hope. Some negative impacts, but probably not as negative as some people fear. So it really comes down to this question of, as a society, do we want wolves? And are the benefits worth the cost? And each person, including wildlife biologists, can look at that same question and the same evidence about the positive or the negative impacts of wolves and come up with a different conclusion based on essentially what they value and how they value different outcomes. And really, I think it's important to keep in mind that all wildlife management decisions and goals are inherently value judgments. And so they incorporate social, political, economic, and scientific factors. And so once the policy goal is set by societal values, the wildlife biologists then use their technical and scientific expertise to accomplish that goal. And a little bit more to add to what Sam was saying about the different values and some people feeling like they want to be heard and this is an opportunity to get heard. I think we can understand the ballot initiative within changing kind of sociocultural context around America's wildlife values. And there's been, I think it's critical to bring up some research by my colleagues, Dr. Mike Manfredo and Dr. Tara Teal, and they've basically been researching people's values towards wildlife in the US over time. And what they found is there's two main types of values. There's people who have what they call domination values. And these are basically people who believe that wildlife is there to be managed for human use. And so people who hunt and fish, generally more kind of consumptive uses of wildlife. And then we have people with more mutualist values, which emphasize basically how humans and wildlife are meant to coexist and how wildlife, they believe that wildlife deserve rights similar to rights of humans. And so those with more mutualist values tend to engage in more non-consumptive uses of nature. And so what my colleagues have found is that essentially when our wildlife agencies were set up, most people had those domination values towards wildlife. And this is still reflected in the way our state agencies are structured and function to this day. And so most state agencies continue to rely on the sale of hunting and fishing licenses, primarily for funding, which are activities that are really kind of those domination value activities. But the CSU researchers have found that modernization has led to kind of a cultural shift among the general public towards more mutualism values. There's still a lot of people with domination values, but we're seeing more people with mutualist values. And mutualist is associated with more support for things like wolf conservation. And the shift might be partly people are living more and more in urban areas, so they're no longer living off the land, so they no longer see wildlife as a threat, something that they have to manage, instead something that they can just go to and see and enjoy. But while this cultural shift has been happening, our state wildlife agencies haven't really been keeping up with this shift. And so research finds that a lot of state agencies still mostly rely on kind of domination values towards wildlife. A lot of the people working there have those values, and this is across the nation. And stakeholders with more mutualist values generally across the nation are not as often incorporated into decision making. And so we're seeing, so this is all the kind of sociocultural context that's setting up the Ballot Initiative, because essentially what we're seeing here with the Ballot Initiative is those with more mutualist values saying, hey, we're increasingly more, we're an increasingly larger portion of the population. We want our values to be heard in decision making. We feel like this is the only way to do so. But then, of course, with the Ballot Initiative, then folks with more kind of domination values or traditional values are saying, hey, but this leaves us behind. What about our values as well? So I think the contentiousness can really be understood as kind of the product of these changing values over time and whose values are considered in decision making.
Becky, you mentioned earlier that your survey results suggest that the support for reintroducing wolves is high across all of Colorado. It's certainly more than 50% in eastern Colorado, on the Front Range, in western Colorado. At the same time, one thing we hear often is about it's asserted, I've heard, that the Front Range is again trying to cram their liberal ideas down the throats of rural Coloradoans, which suggests that there might be some element of those shifting demographics in this Front Range rural divide that we hear about. To what extent does that divide actually exist, and what do your data tell you about what's actually going on there? And what about some of the historical things that have happened in Colorado? Like there was the leg hold trapping ban a few years ago. There was a vote against bear hunts. How does that all play in and play out in this shifting demographic picture that you've painted for us?
Absolutely. I would say that this is, what's interesting is it's not quite the rural urban divide. I would say there's been in several surveys, not just our online survey, but also in the phone survey that was conducted in 2001 as well. We actually found that the majority of West Slope residents would still vote for wolf reintroduction. And but we do find that support is still highest in urban areas. So even though the majority in the West Slope and in more rural areas report, at least in multiple surveys, but once again, surveys are not the perfect predictor of how people will actually behave. They have some error associated with them. But we find that urban support is still a little bit higher than rural support, but generally rural support, West Slope areas, the majority of people still support wolf reintroduction. Although the numbers change though, when you start looking across stakeholder groups though. So let's see, I'm pulling out my numbers here. Something that's interesting is in both the 2001 survey and in our current survey, we do find that support is lower among people who strongly identify as hunters than people who don't. And so support starts to drop there among that stakeholder group. But what's interesting is in both the phone survey and in the online survey, we find that the majority of hunters still support wolf reintroduction, which I find is really interesting because we do have a lot of hunting groups that have formally come out against wolf reintroduction quite adamantly. So that's an interesting dichotomy. And then we also find that with ranching, that also drops off in terms of support. We found mixed evidence, but between all of the surveys that have been conducted, I think it's safe to say, and people know from engaging with these different stakeholder groups as well, that support really drops off among ranchers as well. But I still found in my survey that support was still over 50%. Other surveys found that support was below 50%. So I don't think it's safe to say that the majority of ranchers would support wolf reintroduction. So yeah, so I think the story is a little bit more nuanced than the fact that it's an urban versus rural question, is really what the data shows. And I think we'll find out in the election that that's the best way to understand public perceptions, better than any survey that can be done as well.
Sam, why don't you build on that nuanced perspective, right? You brought up power a little bit earlier. We've talked a little bit about values, potentially shifting values. How does that play out for you when you were trying to cover the story on wolves and, you know, provide really diverse perspectives at the same time trying to represent science? How does that nuance play out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a really tricky thing. I think on the question of like, is it a front range versus Western slope issue? There's a weird way in which that narrative is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, Becky is absolutely right that when, you know, her institution, CSU, has polled different people in Colorado, there doesn't seem to be much difference between people on the Front Range and the Western Slope on this issue. But, you know, I would note that 39 of 64 counties in Colorado, the county commissions in Colorado, have said they are against wolf reintroduction. And a lot of the people on those commissions that I've spoken to, especially up in like Moffat County, which is again where the wolves are now, absolutely see this issue this way, right? They absolutely see it as like these big city people are showing up, putting something on the land that I don't want here. It's going to screw things up. There's going to be less hunting tags. There's going to be attacks on my cows. Like that is very much what they see. And those people are really passionate about this issue too, those county commissioners. So I think when it comes to trying to sort through the nuance of this, it's always really important for me to touch back to the scientists. That's kind of been home base for me, because a lot of this stuff, you get into all kinds of, you know, everything from rumors to misinformation to just straight up passion. And people feel a lot of ways about wolves. And scientists tend to have a good perspective that helps you kind of step back and say, okay, what's really going on here? How do people actually feel? What would wolves actually do? I really appreciate being able to, you know, pick up the phone and call people who study this for a living.
Sam,
Wanna
can you
fo-
build?
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go for it, John.
Sam, I love that you call scientists. You know, where Kristan works and where I work, we're both at the core science institutions. And yet the science can get called into question as well. And I'm wondering if you can share from your perspective as a reporter, how do you know who to trust? How do you know who to believe when you're talking with folks? And then how does that influence what you ultimately put in a story?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the same set of tools that anybody would have. I can read studies and I can ask people questions, and then I can ask them to support their views, right? Like, I think in a lot of ways, having a very low level of knowledge about biology, you know, I was a history major, is actually really great, because I have to really force people to make a really strong case. But I've also found, like, within the scientific community, or at least among the scientists who I've been calling and talking to pretty regularly about all this, they tend to agree about the big questions, right? Like, one big question is, can wolves colonize Colorado on their own? Can they migrate from Yellowstone and create a viable population here? I haven't found a scientist who says, like, yeah, that's likely, that's probably going to happen. Maybe I just haven't talked to that person yet. Maybe there's a study out there I haven't read. But on questions like that, I've actually found scientists are pretty good at being able to manage different perspectives and tell me, okay, here is some level of consensus that we've been able to reach, and here's where we disagree. So I tend to include the part that they say, like, this is more the consensus.
can we just build on this a little bit more too? Because I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. And we had someone, a guest of ours, Martha, in the chat, bring this up. And I know John and I talked about trust. And so we're just going to go there right now because, you know, Sam, you look to science, consensus science and scientists, right? To trust as a source potentially to direct you in the right way. Becky, I know you deal with trust as well too. And it's a very instrumental piece of the conversations that we have at the Institute. I know John has this conversation a lot too about who do you trust? How do you earn that trust? How do you keep that trust? So I'm curious for both of you to maybe speak a little bit about this into your line of work and perspective of how does trust play into the conversations that you have? What are some things that you love to take away about trust in science or trust in information or just trust in general? Becky, do you want to start? And then Sam, you can please follow on too.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I think trust, I know social science research has shown that trust is one of kind of the strongest drivers of people acceptance or opposition to various natural resource management plans. And that can often be trust in the agencies or the implementers of the plan, as well as trust in the other stakeholder groups who they're engaging with or opposing with regard to a natural resource management issue. And so when I think about trust, I think about really kind of the breakdown in trust that led to some of the social conflict over wolves and why this issue is so contentious. And I think and so back in February, our group at CSU helped run a 2-day stakeholder workshop focused on we brought around 31 key stakeholders, hunters, ranchers, environmentalists, animal rights advocates, folks from state agency, as well as sovereign Native American nations, together in a dialogue. And the dialogue was really focused on what is driving this contentiousness, this conflict over wolves. Why is it so contentious? And one of the things that really came out of that dialogue, and that's come out of the social science literature, is that the conflict over wolves is not just driven by different attitudes and beliefs towards wolves, but also by these kind of deeper unresolved debates about natural resource management issues. And this idea that people's trust in the other stakeholder groups have been broken and people are feeling like they're not heard and that they can't trust the other groups, other stakeholder groups that are there to hear them and hear their needs. And so some groups such as ranchers and hunters talked about how they believe that the Ballot Initiative to reintroduce wolves was really part of a broader trend of society kind of not recognizing their values and their contributions to society, as well as their kind of this pending threat to their economic viability. And they felt like it was failing to give recognition to their previous conservation efforts. And then on the other hand, environmentalists felt like this was kind of symbolic as well of their values not being recognized in decision-making, and they couldn't trust that their values would be recognized in decision-making moving forward without the Ballot Initiative. And so what it really came down to is the reason why this is so contentious is because this is about these deeper emotions, this idea of not trusting that other people will hear your needs, hear your deeper values when making decisions about wildlife management. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. This debate is not just about kind of, well, wolves have this impact or this impact or how much of this impact. It's really about these deeper feelings of making sure people feel a sense of belongingness, feel like they can trust others to really incorporate their values in decision making.
So, one of the things that I feel like I've recognized play out in this debate over the past many months now is sensitivity around language. And you've used some of that language, Becky. I've seen you being careful about what you're saying and how you express various thoughts, and Sam as well. And I'm curious about, as it relates to trust or as it relates to how people express their feelings or manipulate feelings. I'm wondering about the role of language. You both work with language a lot. And I'll refer specifically to a question that we got from one of our audience members who had a question for Sam. Sam, you used the term wolf pack, and this audience member says, I thought it was more of a family of wolves, parents plus older and younger litters. So we've got wolf pack, we've got family. This shows up with other language as well, such as there's balance of nature, which I know has come up in Becky's work a lot, ballot box biology. What do you call a wolf? Is a predator, a carnivore, a killer? Can you, Sam, starting with you, Sam, can you speak a little bit to the power of language and how you think about it, and both the language you use and the language you hear?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the pack versus family one is a really good one. For me, covering the group of wolves up in Northwest Colorado, one of the things that I had to kind of contend with immediately was that there was a while where they didn't even have genetic tests. So we didn't even know if these were related wolves. I didn't know what to call it, right? So I used group. It was like the most neutral thing I can think of. Eventually, Colorado Parks and Wildlife did do DNA sampling and tests on some scat they found, and found that I think 4 of these wolves are siblings, but they still don't know if the other 2 wolves are the mating pair. So even now, it's like, what do I say? Do I say pack, probable pack, family, probable family? Like, these are all tricky issues for me as a reporter trying to describe this accurately. But I think as to family versus pack, it's a really good point. I think, the advantages of using the word pack is that this is in the world, right? This is how we refer to a group of wolves. We refer to them as a pack, and it means a certain set of things. At the same time, that word has been loaded with all kinds of incorrect scientific notions that, packs have alphas and betas and omegas, and that came from studies on Oil Royale in National Park in Michigan, which were later completely debunked by the same scientists who wrote the science initially, and found that, it's more about a breeding pair that has a litter, and then they disperse out. There's very little competition for status within the pack. So I think in that way, family is a little more accurate too. Whenever you're trying to decide which word to use, you're absolutely right. It's trying to convey accuracy, but you're also immediately conveying values. And I think a lot about, predator, carnivore, animal. Those are all really tricky words to use. And I try to use them in the correct context. I also get into hiccups where I don't going to use, animal 3 times in a sentence. So what am I going to do? It's tough, but I think at the end of the day, what matters is, are you accurately describing what's happening? That should be the judge by how you use language, and that's how I try to figure out which word is right at the right time.
Becky, did you want to follow on with any of that? I'm curious because I'm sure in the social sciences language comes up. You were talking a little bit about mutualism and domination and things. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how does language play into that?
Absolutely. And language plays a huge role. And that's one of the things I study is what's called framing effects, and how you can give the same information said in a kind of a different way, and that can greatly influence how people perceive this issue. I do think that there's two kind of there's a misperception on both sides of the issue, and I want to address both of these misperceptions that I think are prevalent, that we see often. And I think one of them, I know, John, you mentioned this, is this idea of balance of nature, and I think there's not kind of talking about scientific uncertainty. And so there's a lot of research that suggests that we probably won't see wolves completely transform Colorado's ecosystem, somehow turn Colorado into this whole new kind of balanced ecosystem out there. And so that's but a lot of that scientific uncertainty around kind of what happened in Yellowstone and how much that'll apply to Colorado and what we actually don't know in terms of kind of the drivers of what happened in Yellowstone are not often conveyed, which can lead to this kind of phrase of balance of nature. This is something that encompasses all the different reasons why we want wolves. And then on the other side, we have this phrase ballot box biology that's often used, which is also problematic for several reasons. The first one is I had already mentioned that that there's no decision, that wildlife management is not a decision based just on biology. Wildlife management is equally as about values and whose values are considered in decision making and who has power. But this is a phrase that's used to take values out of it and pretend like that wildlife management is all just about biologists. And then just a couple of other points on that with ballot box biology, people talk about how we should listen to trained wildlife biologists at CPW who have already spoken out against reintroduction. And that's not necessarily accurate as well. The professional CPW wildlife biologists haven't really spoken in any official capacity to our knowledge. And neither the commission nor CPW has taken an official stance on the ballot initiative. And the 2004 Wolf Working Group intentionally did not consider the topic of reintroduction, but only natural migration. So they didn't speak to this issue. And the CPW Commission did pass a resolution in 2016 against reintroduction, but there were no wildlife biologists or scientists on the commission. They're really just political appointees. So, so the decision of the commission was also a political decision, not just a scientific decision. So we have examples on both sides where we're using these phrases that are not necessarily stemmed in truth and stemmed in accepting kind of scientific information and uncertainty, as well as kind of what's really going on behind the scenes.
So Becky, you just mentioned the 2004 wolf management plan that addressed wolves colonizing naturally to repopulate an area. And Sam, a few minutes ago, you also mentioned this group, this family in Northwest Colorado. There have been a few questions in the chat about the science of that and the genetics and so forth. We can't get to all of those questions, but I would like to ask if you both are perceiving that public attitudes would be different, maybe more positive if the wolves recolonized naturally or versus being reintroduced, and what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, I could start. I mean, I know that especially, and if we're talking about language, maybe this is a good time to bring up, like, both sides of this debate try to appeal to what's natural, right? Like Becky talked a little bit about restoring the balance, right? You put wolves back, you return the ecosystem to what it was prior to European colonization, everything gets back in order. That's an appeal to some sort of natural order that doesn't exist right now. On the other side, I've talked to ranchers like Jay Fletcher, who works outside of Steamboat. And he's a huge environmentalist. He maintains his land for the benefit of elk and deer and all kinds of other animals. And he feels great about wolves migrating to Colorado on their own because he thinks that is a normal pattern of thing. He gets really nervous about reintroduction because he worries about the politics of it. Where are you going to put the wolves? How are you going to do that? Who's going to make those sorts of decisions? All of a sudden, it's not something you're responding to. It's something you're actively doing. And his perspective is that we shouldn't do that just because it's, potentially harmful to specific people. And it'd be better just to wait to see if wolves show up on their own and deal with that if it happens. It'll give the wolves more time to adapt. It'll give the people more time to adapt. I don't know, to be totally honest, if we're talking about who we trust, I don't know if that's a talking point or how people legitimately feel, right? Like, I talk to a lot of people who are very invested in this issue. And I have heard that, the wolf opposition groups have pulled on this, and they have found that saying wolves are already on their way to Colorado is the most effective tactic to weaken people's support for reintroduction. So I don't know. I think it's a complicated thing. And I think that if, you are actively reintroducing wolves, that's a decision, and decisions are inherently political and probably more contentious.
Becky, do you have any thoughts on that distinction between wolves that naturally find their way here or find their way here on their own versus reintroduction? What do you see in your survey work and other work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to how much of an impact that has on public opinion, but it's a great study, and I wish I had done that already. That'd be a great thing to look at. But I will say, I do think there's a difference because of what the Ballot Initiative symbolizes that you wouldn't get into with natural recolonization. And that kind of leads back to what I was saying earlier, where the Ballot Initiative is kind of an example of what's bubbling up from this broader sociocultural context of people's values are changing. They want agencies to consider those diverse values. They're trying to be heard, but they feel like the only way to be heard is through this Ballot Initiative, and then the Ballot Initiative feels like an attack on those folks who will have to deal with the negative impact. So I think that's why it's so contentious, because it's really a symptom, and it's a symptom of an issue of not incorporating diverse values in shared decision making, and trying to figure out how do we deal with all these different needs and different concerns and different values moving forward as people's values towards wildlife change over time. And so I think that's where the distinction is. And you wouldn't have to get into all of that with recolonization as much, because it wouldn't be so in your face of right now, it's like we have this Ballot Initiative because of this reason.
Yeah, and a lot of people are bringing up in the chat, I'm seeing that wolves aren't going to colonize Colorado on their own. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen. Like I said, scientists are pretty much in agreement that it's very, very unlikely that they would create a self-sustaining, viable population just through making their way through Wyoming into Colorado. This is just as a political question. Would it be more politically palatable to people if they do, if wolves just made their way into Colorado? Yeah, probably. But that's also, to be really clear, probably not going to happen.
Maybe let's build a little bit on what Becky was saying. And I would like to say, what do you recommend, right, in your line of work? Like, where do we go from here? Like, what would be useful to you all both in both of your lines of work?
Sure, I can dive in here. Well, I think one of the things that I always say about that the social science research shows is when dealing with these value-based debates, which wolf reintroduction is, and you have people with these different values, you have mutualists, you have those with domination values, and you're trying to figure out a pathway forward, and social conflict is escalating. You have groups who are calling the other groups names and spending all of this money trying to campaign against each other. And a lot of research shows that this social conflict can pose a lot of challenges to effective wildlife management. And so to address this social conflict and incorporate these diverse values, social science research suggests that it's really, really important to run participatory processes for decision making in which you bring diverse stakeholders together into the room to help make management decisions alongside wildlife biologists. And so research shows that things like public comment periods, hearings, those are typically not sufficient at addressing value-based debates and can actually escalate social conflict rather than reduce social conflict. And that's because you have a meeting, people come to the meeting, they yell at each other, and then the meeting ends. And then you're kind of left with, okay, what do we do now? And instead, there's been a growing body of research saying that it is possible to get people into the room, to get hunters, to get ranchers, to get environmentalists, to get animal rights advocates, to get sovereign Native American nations together with state wildlife employees and engage in a process where you actually truly get to understand the values and point of views of the other side and their perspective of where they're coming from. And one of the things that we found in our 2-day stakeholder workshop is it really came down to basic human needs. And there were folks at the workshop who were like, I didn't even realize that group on the other side wasn't trying to like obliterate my profession. They're just trying to achieve their own values, and we have different values, but we all have the same needs, and we can respect those needs. And so I think there's a really, really hopeful pathway forward here, where we choose to bring folks together rather than just kind of each lobbying for their own side over and over again to make decisions about wildlife management that truly incorporate diverse values.
Yeah, I'd say.
Go ahead, Sam.
Oh yeah, just to build off that, as far as like what do I want from the public as I report on this, I think what Becky is talking about, those sorts of processes are not going to happen through the ballot campaigns. If the ballot initiative does succeed, that then becomes everything, right? There is no guarantee, even if the ballot initiative passes, that wolves will actually be reintroduced, because it becomes then a process. The sort of thing that Becky is talking about. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has to convene stakeholders, figure out a plan, figure out where the wolves are going to go. They'll be under a legal mandate to do that by the end of 2023. But this is statutory. The legislature could step in and change it. The sort of deliberative politics that we're talking about are not ending with this vote in November. They're only getting going. So I think it's really important for people to understand that, and also to pay attention to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to how they go about enacting or not enacting this mandate from voters, how lawmakers respond. This is just the beginning of a really big political discussion.
So one last question here before we move to a close. Speaking of this stakeholder process and bringing in, being really inclusive, one question that has come up in the chats, and we've heard in Sam's reporting, and Becky, in your survey work, that one of the big issues that we are dealing with is how do we compensate ranchers for lost livestock? And so I wonder what you can, I mean, Becky, for your part, I'm wondering what you're hearing about whether or not compensation actually does improve attitudes or perspectives towards wolves. And Sam, what are you hearing about in terms of what livestock producers feel like they would need to see to feel like their needs are being adequately addressed in this dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, and this was brought up at the stakeholder workshop as well, that compensation is often insufficient. And there was a lot of discussion about kind of indirect effects of wolves on livestock, increasing livestock stress. And also just compensation can be a real challenge to go through that kind of bureaucratic process as well. And it also doesn't address kind of those deeper drivers of social conflict that I was talking about, those feelings of like, hey, my values are not being heard. I feel like you're trying to run over me with this. I feel like my needs, you don't really care about meeting my needs. So that's one of the challenges there. I know the research is, and so it's certainly important, but I think we'll need something more than that to make sure that ranchers actually have a real say in decision-making about how we deal with depredation. I know there's the research on this is quite mixed, and so there's no strong kind of evidence across multiple studies that compensation does increase tolerance towards wolves and other carnivores. The studies have found quite mixed results, and so I think there's some time. This is a time to explore additional approaches as well.
Yeah, so on my end, I recently produced a debate on this issue on Prop 114. One of the participants was Robbie LaValle, who's a county administrator and a rancher in Hotchkiss. She expressed a lot of what Becky is talking about as well when it comes to compensation programs and some of the problems in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, places that have these compensation programs because they also have wolves. Some things that stood out to me from what she said is there's a lot of issues around, like, if a wolf kills my animal, what sort of proof do I need? Do I need to be taking pictures? How do I prove this out? Do I need to do a bunch of paperwork in order to get this money? And the other thing that I thought was really interesting about her points on this was that she feels like people aren't really sensitive to the fact that she actually has an emotional connection to her livestock. That the idea of a wolf chasing down a calf and pulling it apart is really upsetting to her. And I think a lot of people who think about this issue and are in favor of wolf reintroduction see that as kind of ridiculous because, eventually the cows are going to die so we can eat them. And there just seemed to be such an interesting disconnect there between her saying, like, no, this is important to me. I don't want them to die this way. I don't like thinking about my livestock getting killed by wolves in this terrible, painful way. There is so much, and this is something I would love to write about someday. If you go into anti-wolf Facebook groups, the number of pictures of wolves, or sorry, like cattle, elk, different animals that have been killed by wolves is incredible. And it's gruesome and shocking. And there's a lot of really interesting things to say, I think, about like what are the emotional connections these people have with their animals, because that isn't really addressed by a compensation program.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit of that too. This is really complex. I really actually appreciate both of your perspectives tonight. I think we went deeper, right, into some of the societal needs, basic human needs. And I think that's really important for us to talk about. John, any closing thoughts or thing you want to say before I wrap us up tonight?
No, I just, I regret that we have only an hour because there's so much more we could unpack here, but I really, really appreciate the perspectives that both of you have brought to us tonight. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you both for the work that you're doing. It's not easy work, and I'm sure you're both often feel like you're in the crossfires. So I just want to say I appreciate you. I appreciate you participating with us tonight too in the second part of our series and story. And thank you to all of our participants tonight. This was a really engaged audience like we always have. We do not get to all your questions. I apologize in advance. It is tremendous to see them. We are reading them and watching them because they're really important as we think about how do we frame these conversations. What do you all care about? I will give another plug. John mentioned we have that survey, which is another way for you to just kind of share your public perspective and opinion. There'll be a pre and post survey. So just do it once pre, and then you'll get the post after episode number 5. So we've got 3 more episodes coming up, same time, same place, the next 3 Thursdays in a row. We're going to talk about community perspectives next week. So that will be really fascinating. We have an ag producer and rancher, and we have someone from the environmental community joining us next week in a really thoughtful dialogue together. The week after that, we will be talking about the values and cost of wolves. I saw a lot of questions come in here about economic impact. So make sure you join us on October 15th for that one. And then we'll round out the series on October 28th with lived experiences and living with wolves specifically. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We do have recordings available. We'll have written recaps. If you missed the first one on the science episode, just go to institute.dmns.org. It's the Institute for Science Policy website. There's a landing page. You can register if you haven't. You can share the link. You can look at the past recording, and you can look at what we've got in the lineup as well. A huge thank you to my co-moderator, John, here, and our partners up at CSU for helping us put this series together. They've developed a whole set of really great fact sheets that are really accessible for you based on a lot of the research that they've been doing. So I encourage you to check those out too. And I think we're going to drop links to social media in the chat here. I just want to say good night and thank you all for joining us.